The act of walking away in the Jungian sense is not a gesture of avoidance, it is an assertion of the soul's deepest truth. It is the moment when the psyche, no longer willing to trade authenticity for comfort, initiates a profound process of transformation. Each step away from what is false activates ancient archetypes within us. The wanderer who seeks, the warrior who defends the soul's integrity, the alchemist who transmutes suffering, and the self that waits patiently for integration. This departure is not driven by bitterness, nor by rebellion, but by the sacred demand for wholeness. In leaving behind the roles, relationships, and systems that once secured us, we pass through inner thresholds that shape us into something more real. We face the shadow not to be destroyed by it, but to become conscious. We suffer not to remain in pain, but to be remade. We endure the loss of approval to hear, at last, the quiet voice of the self calling us home. Walking away is not the end, it is the beginning of individuation. It is the sacrifice that growth demands. It is the moment we stop seeking to be chosen and begin choosing ourselves, not as an act of ego, but as a vow to the soul. Because the psyche does not seek approval, it seeks wholeness. And in walking away, we finally begin to become who we were always meant to be. To walk away is not weakness. It is the beginning of the return to yourself. The self, that totality of your conscious and unconscious life, does not thrive where your spirit is suffocated. In remaining attached to the worn out, the false, or the toxic, you betray the call of individuation. The sacred journey of becoming whole individuation, as Carl Jung conceived it, and from inherited roles or societal expectations. It is not merely self-improvement or personal development in a surface-level sense. It is the deep and often painful birth of the true self. Central to this process is the act of separation. Not just physical distance or the ending of relationships, but an internal disidentification from everything that is not truly one's own. To individuate, one must walk away, not only from people, but from personas, identities, roles, and beliefs that were adopted unconsciously, often for survival. This kind of walking away is not selfishness, it is self-realization. The journey of individuation requires a kind of radical honesty. One must ask, with piercing sincerity, whose life am I living? Whose values am I embodying? Whose expectations am I sacrificing my soul to meet? Often the answers are uncomfortable. We discover that we have built our lives on borrowed dreams, on cultural myths that do not resonate with our inner truth. Separation becomes necessary, not to escape responsibility, but to assume the ultimate responsibility, the responsibility of becoming who we truly are. Walking away is not an act of abandonment. It is a movement toward the center. In Jungian terms, we live most of our lives at the periphery of consciousness, playing roles in the collective drama of our culture and families. But individuation demands that we withdraw our projections, pull back from the collective unconscious, and find our axis, the self. This cannot be done while entangled in relationships or environments that continually pull us back into patterns that no longer align with who we are becoming. The soul begins to ache in such conditions. There's a quiet revolt that takes place inside, often before it is consciously understood. Discontent, restlessness, even depression may all be signals that the time of separation has come. The archetypal pattern of the hero's journey reflects this necessity. The call to adventure is also the call to separation. The hero must leave the known world, the village, the family, the identity, and enter the unknown. It is a pattern seen in mythology, religion, and psychology because it mirrors a fundamental truth about the psyche. No one can reach spiritual maturity by remaining who they once were. Something must be left behind. And often, the very things we cling to, comfort, approval, familiar dysfunction, are precisely the things preventing our growth. When Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, he was referring to the inherited psychic structures that influence us without our awareness. Our families, cultures, and societies are full of inherited complexes, myths, and expectations. These form part of the psychic matrix we're born into. To individuate, one must become aware of these structures and choose consciously which ones to integrate and which to discard. So separation, then, is not just from external factors, but from unconscious identification. A person may continue to live in the same physical space, yet have separated inwardly from the psychic conditioning that once dictated their choices. But for many, true transformation also requires outward shifts, walking away from environments or relationships that reinforce the very complexes one is trying to transcend. This process is not without pain. There is grief in letting go, even when we are letting go of what harms us. There is fear in becoming unknown to others and to ourselves. Yet within this fear lies freedom. The freedom to no longer perform. The freedom to feel what we truly feel, to believe what we truly believe, and to walk our own path without apology. Individuation requires this kind of inner authority. An inner authority cannot be cultivated while we remain enmeshed in systems or relationships that reward conformity and punish authenticity. Jung also emphasized the need to reconcile opposites within the psyche. Light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, all must be brought into relationship. But such reconciliation cannot occur while we are still entangled in external projections. Walking away often allows us to reclaim our projections and withdraw them back into ourselves. Only then can we begin the alchemical work of integration. The enemies we saw outside become the conflicts we must resolve within. The love we crave from others becomes the love we must learn to give to ourselves. It is in solitude that this work is most potent. Not isolation born of bitterness, but solitude born of sacred intention. In stepping away, we create a container for the soul to speak. In the silence that follows separation, the whispers of the self can finally be heard. Jung understood this deeply. He often retreated to his tower in Belingen, away from the noise of the world, to write, reflect, and dream. He knew that the inner work of individuation demanded space, psychological, emotional, and sometimes physical. But separation does not mean disconnection from humanity. On the contrary, the individuated person is capable of more authentic connection precisely because they are no longer entangled in unconscious dependencies. They relate from wholeness, not from need. They love freely, not out of obligation. By walking away from what stunts their growth, they make space for relationships that nurture their soul. They engage with the world, not as a fragmented persona seeking validation, but as a whole being offering truth. There is a paradox here. The more we separate from the false, the more we return to the real, not just within ourselves, but within others. We begin to see others more clearly when we no longer see them through the lens of our unmet needs. We begin to hear life's deeper rhythms when we no longer drown them out with distractions. It is not about becoming better, it is about becoming whole. And wholeness cannot be achieved by holding on to fragments. What must fall away must fall away. Walking away, then, is not just an option. It is an imperative. For until we separate from what we are not, we cannot return to who we are. The concept of the shadow, as articulated by Carl Jung, is among the most profound and challenging aspects of the psyche to explore. It encompasses all that we deny, repress, or disown within ourselves. Our fears, desires, impulses, traumas, and unintegrated aspects of the personality that have been cast into the unconscious because they do not align with our self-image or social ideals. Yet, what we banish does not vanish. The shadow lives on within us, acting out in subtle and sometimes destructive ways, shaping our perceptions, our behaviors, and especially our relationships. The tragedy is not that we have a shadow, but that we so often choose to carry it unknowingly rather than confront it consciously. To carry the shadow is to let it influence our lives from behind the scenes. It is the unresolved rage that poisons our words, the hidden envy that distorts our friendships, the self-doubt that masquerades as humility, the judgment of others that reflects self-rejection. When the shadow is carried but not faced, we project it onto others, seeing in them the very qualities we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. This projection is a defense mechanism that keeps us from feeling the discomfort of owning our darkness, but it also keeps us trapped in cycles of blame, victimhood, and unconscious behavior. The longer the shadow remains unexamined, the heavier it becomes. It accumulates over time, weighing down the psyche, creating anxiety, depression, compulsions, and existential fatigue. People speak of being tired of life when in truth, they are tired of the mask. They are exhausted by the ongoing effort to suppress their truth and maintain a persona that feels increasingly disconnected from their inner world. The weight of the shadow becomes unbearable, not because it is inherently evil, but because it has been exiled. And anything we exile, we come to fear. To confront the shadow is an act of radical courage. It requires us to look into the mirror of our own psyche and witness parts of ourselves that we have long refused to see. This confrontation is not merely intellectual, it is emotional, visceral, even spiritual. It may involve revisiting past traumas, owning hurtful behaviors, or confronting uncomfortable truths about our motives and desires. The process is rarely linear. The shadow resists exposure. It hides beneath moral righteousness, beneath roles of the martyr or the victim, beneath busyness and overachievement. It shape-shifts. But if we are sincere in our quest for wholeness, we must persist. Jung believed that the shadow is not only a container for the dark aspects of the self, but also for untapped potential. Creativity, power, assertiveness, erotic energy, intuition, and instinct, all of these can be buried in the shadow if they were deemed unacceptable during one's upbringing. For example, a child who was punished for being outspoken may grow into an adult who suppresses their voice, carries resentment, and overcompensates by people-pleasing. In such cases, the shadow holds the key not only to healing, but to recovering lost energy and vitality. What was once shamed can become sacred when brought into the light of awareness. The work of integrating the shadow involves bringing these hidden parts into conscious dialogue. This does not mean indulging every impulse or acting out the contents of the shadow without restraint. It means acknowledging them, understanding their origins, and choosing how to respond rather than react. The aim is not perfection, but integration, a harmony between all aspects of the self. When the shadow is integrated, it no longer controls us from the unconscious. Instead, it becomes a source of authenticity, wisdom, and depth. One of the greatest obstacles to this work is the human desire to be seen as good. Morality, while valuable, can become a prison when it is used to deny the complexity of human nature. We want to be kind, loving, generous, but beneath this desire often lurks anger, judgment, possessiveness, pride. These are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of humanity. To confront the shadow is to accept that we are both light and dark, noble and flawed. It is to recognize that our darkness does not negate our goodness, but gives it depth and context. Spiritual growth in its truest form demands this depth. A spirituality that bypasses the shadow is not healing. It is escaping. When we pretend to be above our wounds, when we speak only of love and light while suppressing rage and grief, we split ourselves in two. This spiritual bypassing creates a fragile identity that cannot withstand the storms of life. But when we confront our shadow, we become grounded, we become whole. We no longer need to pretend to perform or to protect ourselves from our own truth. Relationships are one of the most powerful arenas where the shadow reveals itself. Romantic partners, family members, and even casual acquaintances can act as mirrors for our unconscious material. When we find ourselves intensely irritated, overly attached, or emotionally triggered, the shadow is usually at play. To confront it in these moments is to ask not what is wrong with them, but what is being shown to me about myself. This shift from projection to introspection is at the heart of shadow work. It requires humility, honesty, and a willingness to be transformed. It is also important to understand that confronting the shadow is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process, a lifelong relationship with the unconscious. Just as the seasons change and the moon waxes and wanes, so too do different aspects of the shadow come into focus at different times in our lives. New challenges, transitions, and losses often bring fresh material to the surface. Rather than resisting this, we can approach it with curiosity and compassion. Each encounter with the shadow is an invitation to go deeper, to become more fully ourselves. Ultimately, the decision to confront rather than carry the shadow is a choice for liberation. It is a step away from self-deception and towards self-awareness. It is an act of love, not only for ourselves but for the world. For when we own our darkness, we stop projecting it onto others. We become less reactive, more empathic, more grounded in reality. We cease to add to the chaos and instead contribute to the healing of the collective psyche. This is the essence of spiritual maturity. Not the pursuit of perfection, but the embrace of wholeness. And that wholeness can only be achieved by facing the very things we once feared within ourselves. To confront the shadow is to say, I am willing to know myself in full. And in doing so, we lighten the load. We no longer carry the shadow. It becomes part of us, but it no longer defines us. We walk lighter. We walk freer. And it is only then that we are truly prepared to walk away from the illusions of who we thought we had to be and move toward the truth of who we are becoming. For walking away is often the first step in facing that shadow consciously. The human psyche has always responded to symbols. Whether they arise in dreams, rituals, myths, or spontaneous moments of clarity, symbols act as bridges between the conscious and the unconscious. They are not merely metaphors, but carriers of psychological truth, emerging when language fails to fully express the depths of inner experience. In the act of leaving, whether it be a relationship, a belief system, a job, or a version of oneself, we encounter some of the most potent symbols of liberation. These moments are not simply practical decisions. They are sacred rites, thresholds where the soul marks its own evolution. Leaving is often viewed externally as abandonment, loss, or failure, but inwardly it can be the moment when the soul finally breathes. The door that closes behind us, the silence that follows a goodbye, the solitary walk away from what wants to find us. These are not just events. They are psychological symbols carrying the energy of liberation. In mythology, leaving the familiar is the call to adventure. It marks the hero's departure from the ordinary world into the unknown, a journey that will ultimately lead to transformation. This departure is never just physical. It is spiritual. It signals the beginning of the descent into the unconscious, where one must confront hidden truths and reclaim lost parts of the self. Symbols of liberation often emerge from what seems like despair. A person sitting alone in their car after walking away from a long-term relationship might notice a sudden light breaking through the clouds, or hear a song on the radio that speaks directly to their inner state. These are not coincidences. The psyche is speaking. The world mirrors the internal shift through synchronistic symbols. In Jungian psychology, such symbols are not fabrications of the imagination, but meaningful images that arise when the unconscious and the conscious mind begin to communicate. These symbols hold power because they contain emotional truth. They reveal the inner movement that may still be beyond words. One of the most profound symbols that arises during the act of leaving is the threshold. The image of a door, a gate, a bridge. These are recurring motifs in dreams and myths during moments of departure. The threshold is not only a point of transition, it is a symbol of choice and agency. To step over it is to leave behind the known and enter the field of possibility. It represents the moment where fear is overcome, where the old self releases its grip, and where the soul, though trembling, begins to move toward its destiny. Every time we cross such a psychological threshold, we reaffirm our commitment to inner truth, regardless of the external consequences. Another symbolic image that frequently appears in these moments is the shedding of skin. This is drawn from nature. Snakes, insects, and even trees go through processes of letting go what no longer serves them in order to continue growing. When a person walks away from a role, an identity, or a way of life, they are undergoing a similar symbolic process. The old skin is tight, restrictive, no longer aligned with the being it once contained. The act of shedding is not clean or painless. It often involves tearing, rawness, exposure. Yet it is necessary. Without shedding, there is no renewal. The symbol here is liberation not as lightness or instant joy, but as the deep, necessary discomfort of rebirth. Freedom also appears in the symbol of the open road or path. After walking away, many people report a sudden clarity, even if it is mixed with sadness or uncertainty. There's a quality of space that opens up, a psychological spaciousness that had been denied, while they remained confined by what they could no longer endure. The open road is more than a literal highway or trail. It is the internal recognition that movement is possible again. Where once they felt trapped, they now sense an unfolding. The road symbolizes the future that becomes accessible only when the chains of the past are released. It reminds the psyche that liberation is not just an escape, but an orientation toward a new direction. Sometimes, the symbols are darker before they are illuminating. The image of fire often arises in the psyche during periods of intense release. Fire destroys. Yes, but it also purifies. It reduces the unnecessary to ash so that the essential may remain. When someone walks away from a situation that has caused prolonged suffering, the emotional intensity can feel like burning. Rage, grief, sorrow, these elements of psychic fire sweep through the being. The more we contort ourselves to fit into the mold of others' expectations, the more disconnected we become from the living truth within us. We begin to forget what we truly think, feel, believe, or desire. Our voice is replaced by echoes. Our authenticity is buried under performance. In Jung's terms, the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate society, is a necessary function. But when we over-identify with the persona, we lose touch with the self. We confuse who we are with how we are perceived. We learn to smile when we feel hollow, to agree when we dissent, to comply when our soul cries out for rebellion. This dissonance creates inner tension. Anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of meaninglessness often emerge not from failure, but from the successful maintenance of a life that is not our own. The soul begins to ache for authenticity. It whispers in quiet moments. It stirs in dreams. It grows restless in silence. And eventually, it demands a reckoning. To depart from conformity is not to reject community, but to reclaim individuality. It is to risk misunderstanding for the sake of inner alignment. It is to walk away from the crowd not out of arrogance, but out of devotion to truth. This is the path of individuation. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but an organic movement away from what no longer serves the unfolding of one's unique nature. It requires solitude, self-reflection, and often grief. One grieves the comfort of fitting in, the identity shaped by others' approval, the relationships that depended on one's silence. Yet what is gained in exchange is infinitely more valuable: integrity, inner peace, and a sense of meaning that cannot be purchased or prescribed. This process often begins with rupture. Something within the conforming life starts to fracture. A job that once brought satisfaction now feels empty. A relationship built on pretense begins to suffocate. A belief system that once provided certainty now rings hollow. These ruptures are invitations. They are signs that the self is stirring beneath the surface, urging us to turn inward and listen. The discomfort is not the enemy, it is the teacher. It points to the misalignment, to the parts of ourselves we have disowned in the name of belonging. To follow this discomfort is to begin the journey home. Symbols arise on this journey, as they often do in Jungian work. A recurring dream of being trapped in a uniform, of being lost in a crowd, of searching for a hidden door. All of these may reflect the soul's desire to break free from conformity and reclaim its autonomy. The unconscious speaks in images, not words. And in these images, we find the map. The door we search for in dreams is the door we must find in waking life, the door out of the script we were handed and into the life we are meant to live. This departure from conformity is not a one-time act, but an ongoing practice. Every day presents new choices: to speak truthfully or to stay silent, to act from the heart or to follow the rules, to honor intuition or to seek validation. The self is not discovered in grand declarations, but in small courageous acts of alignment. It grows each time we choose authenticity over acceptance, depth over comfort, solitude over false connection. And though this path may appear lonely from the outside, it is deeply intimate within. It connects us not only to ourselves but to others who have also dared to live from the inside out. The challenge is that society often rewards conformity and punishes deviation. To step outside the mold is to risk criticism, rejection, even exile. But conformity that betrays the soul is a quiet death. It is a life spent in exile from one's own truth. And no external reward can compensate for the loss of the self. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This privilege is not handed to us. It is earned through the willingness to confront the discomfort of being different, to endure the solitude that sometimes comes with authenticity, and to trust that the path of truth leads somewhere meaningful, even when we cannot yet see where. At some point, walking away from conformity becomes not just an option, but a necessity. The soul cannot breathe in a life built on lies. It cannot thrive where it is not seen, heard, or honored. So we must leave the expectations that suffocate, the roles that limit, the masks that conceal. And in leaving, we find the symbols of liberation that begin to emerge. The first breath of relief, the clarity that follows confusion, the dream that returns after years of silence. These are not abstractions. They are the psyche's way of signaling that we are on the right path. To live in alignment with the self is not to live without conflict, but to live with purpose. It is to navigate life's challenges with a sense of rootedness. knowing that we are not acting out someone else's script. It is to create from the core, to love from the truth, to stand with both feet in our own reality. This is not conformity, this is creation. And only when we stop seeking ourselves in the mirror of others can we begin to see the self reflected in its fullness. For individuation requires separation. Separation from the false, the borrowed, the imposed. Separation from the illusions that kept us safe but small. And in that courageous act of departure, the self is not lost. It is found. Growth is a noble pursuit, but it is rarely a gentle one. The romanticized version of personal evolution often overlooks its true cost. In reality, growth demands sacrifice, not in a punitive or moralistic sense, but in the deeply psychological and archetypal sense that something must be surrendered for something greater to emerge. Nothing grows in stagnant soil. For the soul to evolve, the old ground must be broken, comfort must be disturbed, familiarity must be questioned. It is through this dissolution of what has been that something new can begin to take shape. In the journey of individuation, as articulated by Jung, the self does not simply unfold like a flower. It is forged in the fires of tension, choice, and often loss. The self asks us to release who we thought we were so we might discover who we truly are. This process cannot occur without sacrifice. It demands the letting go of outdated identities, inherited narratives, relationships that reflect a past self, belief systems that no longer serve, and patterns of avoidance that kept us safe but stagnant. Each of these losses can feel like a small death. And they are, because something within us is dying, making room for something more real, more alive, and more complete. People often come to the threshold of transformation desiring change, but hoping not to lose anything in the process. They want growth without disruption, rebirth without death, healing without confrontation. But the psyche does not work that way. The unconscious is not interested in maintaining illusions. It is interested in wholeness. And wholeness requires integration, which often means dismantling the parts of our life built on falsehoods, defenses, or half-truths. This dismantling can feel like destruction, but it is a necessary stage in the alchemical process of becoming. In alchemy, the stage of negrito, blackness, is where dissolution begins. The material breaks down, decomposes, returns to its primal state so that it can be reformed. Psychologically, this stage mirrors the moment when our structures begin to crumble. The job that defined us loses its meaning. The relationship that sustained us reveals its cracks. The worldview that made sense of everything begins to feel hollow. These moments are often accompanied by grief, disorientation, even despair. But they are also the sacred beginnings of growth. The darkness is not the absence of life, but the soil in which new life takes root. The illusion had to be surrendered so that truth could be lived. These sacrifices, while painful, become sacred in retrospect. They mark the turning points, the thresholds, the moments when the soul chose expansion over safety. And though we may grieve what was lost, we come to cherish what was gained, a life that is real, a self that is whole. The act of sacrifice is not a detour on the path of growth. It is the path. It is the price of admission to authenticity, to freedom, to inner peace. And it must be paid not once, but over and over in different forms and seasons, because each new level of growth will ask us to release something we once held dear. But in letting go, we create space. Space for the unknown, for the sacred, for the self to speak. And in that space, we come to understand what the shadow always tried to teach us. Not through repression or fear, but through honest confrontation. We come to realize that the darkness was not punishment, but initiation. And we understand, at last, that the self is not found in conformity. It is revealed in the crucible of becoming. At the center of our psychological lives lies a quiet but persistent yearning, not to be liked, accepted, or praised, but to be whole. This yearning comes not from the ego, which seeks applause and confirmation, but from the deeper structure, the psyche itself. Jung called this movement toward unity the process of individuation, the lifelong journey through which a person integrates all aspects of their being, both conscious and unconscious, into a coherent, authentic self. Approval may gratify us temporarily, but wholeness transforms us. And the psyche, in its archetypal wisdom, is not content with surface victories. It wants nothing less than our full becoming. From early life, we are conditioned to seek approval. As children, we learn that affection often comes with compliance. We become experts at reading the room, adapting ourselves to avoid conflict or gain attention. This adaptation is not inherently wrong. It is part of survival, but it comes at a cost. Slowly, the inner compass is replaced by an external one. We begin to prioritize what others expect over what we feel. We learn to censor instincts, mute emotions, and silence intuition if they clash with the dominant narrative. We develop a persona, a mask that earns us approval, but hides our truth. Jung warned of the danger of over-identifying with the persona. The more we lean into approval, the more fragmented we become internally. Parts of the psyche that do not fit the approved image are repressed into the unconscious. This includes our anger, our sadness, our sexuality, our creativity, anything that threatens the constructed identity, but repression does not equal erasure. These disowned parts become the shadow, and the shadow, left unattended, exerts unconscious influence. It appears in projections, patterns, compulsions, and dreams. It demands recognition, not because it is evil, but because it is part of us. Wholeness requires that we reclaim what we have cast away, not to justify all impulses, but to bring them into awareness and transform them. Living for approval makes this work almost impossible. When we are attached to being seen as good, right, admirable, or enlightened, we avoid anything that might contradict the image. We resist confrontation, avoid failure, and pretend not to feel what we feel. In doing so, we stunt our growth. True psychological development is not a linear ascent, but a spiral descent into the hidden chambers of the self. It is messy, non-linear, and often painful. It requires facing the parts of ourselves that are not flattering. But this is the work that brings integration, depth, and freedom. The psyche does not seek perfection, it seeks integration. To integrate is not to eradicate flaws, but to hold opposites in tension. It is to admit that we can be both loving and resentful, confident and insecure, wise and wounded. It is to create space for the full range of human experience without shame or denial. This inner spaciousness allows energy to flow freely. Symptoms begin to resolve, compulsions soften, creativity returns. The soul, long suffocated by masks, begins to breathe. Much of our suffering comes from the gap between who we are and who we think we should be. This internal conflict creates anxiety, depression, and self-alienation. The cure is not more approval. It is deeper honesty. It is the courage to ask, what am I pretending not to feel? What do I need to release? What part of me have I abandoned for the sake of fitting in? These questions pierce the illusion of control and bring us back to the rawness of the moment. And in that rawness, we find something astonishing. Not shame, but relief. To be whole is to be free. Our culture feeds the addiction to approval. It rewards performance, promotes comparison, and pathologizes vulnerability. It teaches us to curate identities, to market ourselves, to equate worth with visibility. But the soul speaks a different language. It does not care about followers, status, or applause. It cares about truth, meaning, and connection. It cares about depth, and it suffers when we trade authenticity for image. This suffering is often misdiagnosed. People come to therapy complaining of dissatisfaction, emptiness, anxiety. But beneath the surface is often a deeper malaise, the soul's protest against living a divided life. Jung believed that neurosis is frequently the result of a conflict between the ego and the self. The ego wants to preserve its image. Until the ego surrenders to something larger, the psyche remains at war with itself. Surrender does not mean defeat. It means allowing the deeper wisdom of the self to guide the process. It means admitting that approval will never be enough, that no amount of praise can fill the void left by disconnection from our true nature. This realization is not bitter. It is liberating. It frees us to live from within. It frees us to become real. Symbols play a vital role in this transformation. Dreams, art, myths, synchronicities, they all reflect the inner process. A recurring image of being naked in public may represent the fear of exposure. A dream of returning to a childhood home may symbolize the need to revisit early wounds. These symbols are not random. They are messages from the unconscious guiding us toward wholeness. When we listen, we begin to see that even our suffering carries meaning. Even our lostness points the way. To follow the psyche's longing for wholeness often means walking away from systems of approval. This is not rebellion for its own sake, but a sacred necessity. We may have to leave environments that reward inauthenticity, distance ourselves from relationships built on performance, or abandon roles that keep us small. These departures are painful, but they create space. And in that space, the symbols of liberation appear, symbols that do not flatter the ego, but awaken the soul. There is immense courage in choosing wholeness over approval. It means letting go of who we were taught to be and reclaiming who we are. It means living with integrity even when it costs us popularity. It means honoring intuition even when it contradicts reason. It means saying no when yes is easier, and saying yes when fear screams no. It means becoming real. As we move further along this path, we begin to attract different experiences. People who value authenticity over charm. Work that nourishes the soul instead of draining it. Solitude that feels rich rather than empty. We begin to live in alignment, not because we have mastered life, but because we have stopped running from it. We no longer need to be perfect. We need only to be whole. And so we walk, not toward approval, but toward integration. Not toward applause, but toward silence. Not toward perfection, but toward truth. The self waits patiently, not in the spotlight, but in the shadow. And it comes forward when we finally choose to leave behind the life we built to please others and step into the life that reflects who we truly are. This is the turning point, the sacred threshold. And though the world may never reward us for this choice, our soul will. Because the self is not found in conformity, it is revealed in the crucible of becoming. There comes a moment in every deep psychological journey when walking away is not an escape but an initiation. It is the crossing of an invisible threshold that signals the end of one psychic chapter and the beginning of another. In Jungian terms, such a moment does not occur in isolation. It activates ancient patterns within the psyche, archetypes that guide and govern the process of transformation. When we walk away from situations, people, or identities that no longer serve our individuation, we do more than make a decision. We awaken symbols, energies, and inner forces that have existed long before us. This is not abandonment, it is metamorphosis. The archetype of the wanderer is one of the first to awaken when we walk away. It is the energy of the soul in motion, seeking something beyond the limits of the known world. This archetype is not concerned with social convention or external approval. It is rooted in a deeper instinct to discover what lies on the other side of our conditioning. When the wanderer stirs within, we may feel restless, unsatisfied, even slightly mad by society's standard. But this madness has a sacred function. It disrupts the inertia of conformity and pushes us toward inner truth. In walking away, the wanderer doesn't reject the world out of bitterness, but leaves it out of necessity. Something within has shifted, and the outer life must now reflect the inner truth. Closely following the wanderer is the seeker. This archetype does not walk away for the sake of rebellion. It walks toward meaning. The seeker longs for something essential, something lost or never fully known. It asks profound questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is real? And it accepts that the answers cannot be found within the limits of our comfort zones. In many myths, the seeker departs from the ordinary world and enters the unknown, often alone, often afraid. This mirrors the psychological experience of transformation. It is not glamorous. It is disorienting, painful, raw. But it is also the space where growth becomes possible. Because the known structures, the persona, the mask, the adaptation, have been left behind. Walking away also calls forth the archetype of the death-rebirth cycle, often symbolized by the phoenix or the crucifixion motif. It is here that the ego undergoes its most intense trial. When we leave behind a relationship, career, community, or identity that once defined us, we are not just changing our environment, we are dying to a previous version of ourselves. This symbolic death is terrifying. It brings grief, confusion, even despair. But from the standpoint of the soul, it is essential. The old self must dissolve so that a more integrated self can be born. This process cannot be circumvented. It must be felt, endured, and honored. The psyche, in its archetypal intelligence, knows this pattern and moves through it again and again in different forms. The warrior is another archetype activated in the act of departure. Contrary to popular belief, the warrior is not aggressive for its own sake. It is the energy that defends the soul's integrity. It gives us the courage to say no when yes would be safer. It helps us hold boundaries, speak truth, and walk alone when necessary. This energy is often misunderstood in spiritual circles, where kindness and acceptance are overemphasized at the expense of clarity and strength. but transformation is not always gentle. Sometimes it is a rupture. Sometimes it is a sword cutting through illusion. The warrior archetype brings the capacity to protect what is emerging within us, even when others do not understand. The alchemist then emerges slowly and quietly. This is the archetype of inner transformation, of turning base material into gold. In psychological terms, it is the process of integrating the shadow, healing trauma, and transmuting suffering into wisdom. When we walk away, we are often flooded with unresolved emotions, anger, sadness, regret, doubt. The alchemist does not reject these feelings. It works with them, studies them, turns toward them. It sees the pain not as an obstacle, but as the prima materia, the raw material for inner growth. This archetype teaches us that nothing is wasted, that every wound can become a source of light if we are willing to do the inner work. As the journey deepens, the archetype of the sage becomes active. The sage does not speak loudly, it whispers from within, often after long periods of silence. It is the voice of intuition, inner knowing, and timeless wisdom. When we walk away from external validation and noise, we begin to hear this voice more clearly. The sage does not offer quick fixes or certainty. Instead, it teaches us how to live in the tension of the unknown, how to find peace in not having all the answers. It reminds us that transformation is not a destination, but a way of being, a lifelong unfolding of deeper and deeper layers of the self. Perhaps the most important archetype that becomes accessible when we walk away is the self. Jung's concept, the totality of the psyche, the unity of conscious and the unconscious. The self is not the ego, it is the source of the ego. It is the center that holds all opposites together, the inner guide that leads us toward wholeness. Walking away allows the ego to loosen its grip, to admit that it does not have control over everything. In this humility, the self can begin to shine through. Dreams become more vivid. The synchronicities increase. Life begins to feel less random and more meaningful. We are no longer just surviving or performing. We are aligning with something deeper and more enduring. The movement of walking away then is not merely about separation. It is about activation. It is the spark that lights the sacred fire. It sets in motion forces that have been dormant, waiting for a moment of truth to awaken. Each archetype plays its part, guiding us through the stages of dissolution, discovery, and integration. And though the journey is arduous, it is also profoundly beautiful, because it reconnects us to something ancient within, a blueprint for becoming whole. This process asks everything of us. It asks us to sacrifice comfort for depth, certainty for authenticity, image for essence. We are no longer content with surface-level living. We are drawn to soul-level engagement, and in this we may lose the world, but we find ourselves. This is the paradox of transformation. To truly change, we must first let go. We must trust the wisdom of the psyche, the archetypal intelligence that has guided countless souls before us and will continue to do so long after us. To walk away is not to fail or to give up. It is to say yes to something deeper. It is to heed the call of the self and begin the sacred work of becoming. And though we may carry wounds from the past, we no longer carry them as burdens. We carry them as teachers, as signs, as sacred weight that prepared us for the road ahead, because growth demands sacrifice.